our local surveyor, who I think has a state office, or is it national? Anyway, he's moving out. And he, of course, you all know that he lives up Gopher Valley with his lovely wife, and is a father and a grandfather, and very noted in writing things and bringing history to life. And we're glad tonight that he's here to tell us about donation land claims. Thanks.
Everybody hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Right?
We can hear that.
Okay. It's directional. Okay.
No, it's not.
Can you hear me?
No. It's making a sound.
Picks up everything but voice. No way.
You're not plugged in.
No, no. Can you hear me?
No.
You want me to bring this one down?
Yeah, I wonder.
Will it squeak when I do that?
Will it reach?
I'll shut that one up.
Yes, it will squeak.
We just set it on the floor there. Okay, can you hear me now? All right.
Yeah.
So, here. Going to have a little fun with this tonight, I hope. I've got a few pop questions in there for you. Let's see who's still awake in the audience. And so, can everybody see that okay? All right. We're going to cover Oregon history, the various types of land claims, because donation land claims are not the only one, the specifics of donation land claims, what they went through in the 1850s to get a donation land claim, and a little bit on how to research. I don't want to go into too much detail on that, because it's even kind of a shrouded mystery to me sometimes. Surveyors have a lot of hard time sometimes uncovering what's called junior-senior rights on donation land claims, and that basically is just establishing who was there or had their claim first. And it doesn't necessarily pertain to who was the first settler. It doesn't have much to do with that. It's more with the process the government set up for these claims. So we're going to cover a little bit of Oregon history here, and of course, before 1792, we have the three factors here, and all these explorers they were all hearing about this Oregon, which meant the beautiful river. If any of you have any comments or questions as I go through this, I may not have answers, but feel free. Just open up on it. So in 1792, Robert Gray came in, and he came in on that ship, the Columbia, and he named that river after his ship. So here we go in 1804 through 1806, and they spent, Lewis and Clark spent the winter here in 1805. And the United States really didn't have a claim to be here. And of course, Jefferson was a great expansionist and wanted to make reality so that we went from one ocean to the other. And of course, then in 1810, John Jacob Astor with the trading company put it where Astoria is now. Of course, the first city in Oregon. And now we had occupancy. And of course, then we had to work out a treaty with the British in 1818, and we said we're going to fix the northern boundary at the 49th parallel. From there, it would go west to the Rocky Mountains. And that was a joint occupancy agreement. Everything south of that 49th was basically ours down to the Mexican territory. or the Spanish, we had the Spanish Treaty of 1819, just the next year, that fixed the southern boundary at the 42nd parallel. You otherwise know that as the northern line of California, southern line of Oregon now. So the U.S.-Russian Treaty, wow, look at that, 5440. You've heard the words 5440 or fight. And of course, that took on new meaning within just a few years there. And in 1824, that's basically what we were looking at for the Oregon Territory. And I don't have any idea how many thousands of square miles it is, but it's a lot of territory. All of Oregon, Idaho, Washington, clear up into Canada. And of course, in 1843, the Provisional Government was created, and Yamhill County was one of the first. It was at the time, in the lower left-hand corner there in pink. Yamhill County at that time was over 8,000 square miles. We were dwarfed, of course, by the other three. Champoeg went on, of course, to become Marion after the famous Civil War general. And Clackamas is still Clackamas. It doesn't comply with that. It doesn't conform to that kind of shape anymore. And Tuolumne, of course, later became Washington County. So that's 1843. Some people call those counties now. They really weren't counties. They were districts in those days. But the British kept claiming everything north of the Columbia River. And we kind of had a little battle going on. In 1846, then we came up with the Oregon Compromise. And once again, we said, up to the 49th parallel. And of course, we had the war with Mexico in 1848, and we had the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, and we ended up with all the property south of that 42nd parallel I mentioned earlier. So in 1846, here is the U.S.-British boundary treaty map. It's kind of hard to see much detail on that, but once again, we're still covering the same area that they were talking about 30 years earlier, basically. But they had now kind of agreed to a certain extent, who was going to have what. And about the midpoint of the map, you see that arc there, that's where everything north of that, I think at this time, by 1846, the British were claiming, and we had claimed everything south of that. And of course, west of the Rocky Mountains to the Oregon coast and down to the northern boundary of California there. So 1848, here comes the Territorial Government. Finally, we've got a territory. So that means that there's an intent on the behalf of the United States Congress to create a state eventually. That's the first step toward statehood. The Territorial Districts in 1851, now that was 1843, so 3 years later, this is what the counties look like 3 years later. Now, I don't know what that lower one means when it says attached to Umpqua. I really don't know much about that. Of course, there is no Umpqua County now, but back then there was. And you can see that Yamhill County kept getting smaller. We did, in 1851, go to the Pacific Ocean. And we got whittled down further from that, starting at over 8,000 down to 718 today, 8,000 miles. So here we go. Here's the big birthday, February 14th, 1859. Here's a description. I'm not going to go through this, but this is the description of the entire state of Oregon after 1859 statehood. We end up at 96,003 square miles, and that includes 2,383 square miles of water. When you look at your property description, unless you happen to live in a city where you own a lot, a block of a subdivision or something, if you live out in the country, your legal description is going to be much longer than that in many cases. But that's 96,000 square miles. It's a lot of area. And there it is at statehood. That's what the counties look like. Wasco County, of course, had gobbled up the entire, everything east of the Cascade Mountains there. So, and we still had Umpqua County. Jackson, Josephine, Curry. So you can see a lot of the counties, in this area look pretty much like they did then. They look like it right now. So here we go into donation land claims, and this is a little bit of the timeline, and you'll see these as we go through this. You'll see how this advances. 1810, we had very few settlers here, and then of course the Hudson Bay trappers came along. But in 1821, Dr. John Floyd, who was from the Virginia delegate, he was a delegate from the state of Virginia to Congress, and he kept trying to get Oregon occupied. So he wanted to send people here on the promise that they would get land, and he kept throwing out these bills, and they kept failing. And there was a lot of politics, and dirty politics, even way back then. Just imagine that. In 1825, Dr. John McLaughlin came up with Fort Vancouver, and of course the Hudson Bay settlers, once the popularity of the beaver skin hats and whatnot started dropping off, why they started losing their jobs. 1834, here comes the missionaries, and settled down in the Salem area, a lot of them. And 1842, John laid out his Oregon City, his claim at where Oregon City is now. And of course in 1843 was the first massive Oregon Trail immigration. So there we go. There's the Provisional Government started in 1843. So at Champoeg, May 2nd, 1843, there were 102 male voters, and it was a vote of 52 to 50 to create a state. So they wanted to do that, and it was close. It was really close. So the center of all political activity in the state of Oregon was Oregon City at that time. And even after statehood, there was a lot of discussion about why is our capital centered in Salem instead of Oregon City. There was a lot of debate in the legislature at that time over that kind of thing. So July 1843, the organic law came up from Congress and said that we are going to have this provisional government until the United States should basically make us into a state. So it took from 43 to 59. Article 3 of that bill did relate to land. And here's what it said. You could establish a claim by natural boundaries or by marks at the corners and on the lines. That claim had to be recorded in the office of the Territorial Recorder. You had to make improvements on your land within 6 months. And you had to become an occupant within 1 year. One square mile per person, per settler. And it had to be in a square oblong form according to natural situations. Nobody knows what that means. It was going to be described by meets and bounds, and there was one claim per individual. Pop quiz, here we go. Somebody just asked the question. What does meets refer to? Anybody know? Metering, right. Measuring property. How about bounds? Identifying properties that adjoin or abut the property that you're describing. So if you bound up against Smith's property, then that's your boundaries. There was no claim allowed if there was a city or town, and if there were water privileges that affected that, situations of mercantile or manufacturing, then you couldn't claim there. If it was to the detriment of the community, or you couldn't claim where there was a mission or something of religious character. Couldn't do it. If it wasn't occupied, now this is an amendment that was made in 1846, you could pay $5 annually to the treasurer. That just says that if you didn't get out there and start tilling a little bit, then you could pay $5, which was a lot of money in 1846, and that was just before the gold rush in California, of course. But if you didn't pay that $5 to the provisional government treasurer, then you'd lose that claim. They did have partnerships, but they couldn't exceed 640. But you did see some 1280 claims by partners. And the boundaries were to form as near as could be to cardinal points. Here we go, another quiz. Anybody know what that means? Cardinal.
North, south, east, west.
He knew, Mr. Herring. Cardinal directions based on magnetic or true north?
True.
Good answer. Okay, so 1848 to 1859, we had territorial government. In August 14th of 1848, they did formally come out and say, we're going to make this a state eventually, so, and then of course 11 years later it did become a state. But the Provisional Government's land laws were going to remain in effect. That was the ones from 1843 to 1848 until the Donation Land Act of 1850. So the Donation Land Act came into place 9 years before we even became a state. But this Territorial Act didn't provide for any land surveys. And that caused a lot of trouble. The settlers here were very unhappy, to say the least, because some of them had been here 6, 7, 8 years and settled their what they thought were their claims, and here's Congress saying, nah, we don't even recognize you. So in 1849, there was finally enough of a ruckus created that they said, okay, we'll come up, make those real. So Sam Thurston was the territorial delegate, and he did come up with this bill, and it was the Oregon Donation Land Act of September 27, 1850. And so there, once again, 9 years later, our birthday. So here you're starting to see the timeline again. Congress assumed the surrender of Indian title to their lands. Well, that's a pretty big assumption. That caused no end of trouble later. They did create the Office of the Surveyor General, and that was in Oregon City at the time. And of course, they provided to survey all these hundreds of thousands of miles in both Oregon and Washington Territory. And it did say that there would be a donation of land to settlers. It voided all the previous land laws, but if you had made your claim prior to December 1st of 1850, you could re-register that claim with the new Surveyor General in the territory. It was John Preston. He arrived in 1851 in Oregon City. I think he came around the Horn by ship, by steamer. And those are presidential appointees. He only lasted just a year or two. And we got a new president, and he got fired. And there was another one appointed, some kind of a political connection there. So the public land system, the public land survey system, the Surveyor General sent out these crews, and they go out and survey in accordance with the Land Ordinance of 1785, which has been used back in the eastern states for many, many years, obviously. And it took them about 3 weeks to come up with the initial point. Has anybody in this room been to the initial point of the entire of the meridians in Oregon? It's up in a little park in the West Hills of Portland. So here you see a little bit about the townships. When they talk about this township north or west, they're always talking in relationship to that meridian, that central meridian where the baseline and the meridian come together. And so each township is 36 square miles. Numbering in the upper right-hand corner, you see the red square on the right-hand side. That's number 1. And it goes across to 6 to the left, and just kind of, it's kind of a serpentine on down to, it ends up at 36 down the lower right-hand corner. On the left map, it shows the meridian going north and south. And of course, everything on the ranges to the east of that meridian, those are 6 miles on each one of those. So it's 36 miles you're looking at total by 36 miles the other way. So every one of those squares is 36 square miles in and of itself. So there's a lot of square miles there. And that's, we're only looking at just a matter of, 36 total townships there. So we have, in this county, we start with Township 2 South. So it'd be the second one up from the bottom. And we don't even start until we get clear over to 3 West. So we would be kind of over on that left green arrow, and that's where we'd start with our county. So you get a little bit of an idea of how many miles they were trying to survey. Because every one of those smaller squares got cut up into square miles. So there's a mile, and that's how they would describe those, the northwest quarter, or the southeast quarter, or the northeast quarter on the right-hand side there. And of course, you could divide that down. Those quarters of quarters are 40 acres. Because if you divide 640 acres, which is a square mile, by 16, you're going to get 40 acres. These are what the requirements were. You had to be a resident by that date. You could be white or American half-breed Indian male. No females allowed on that side of things. You could be a citizen. You had to be a citizen of the U.S. or have the intention to become one. You had to be above the age of 18. And so there were many tales about the young men who were 17 and they put the number 18 on a piece of paper and put it in their shoe and they stand in front of Justice of the Peace and say, I'm over the age of 18. They had to reside on and cultivate the land for 4 years. They could get a half of a square mile if they were single, or if they were married, 640 acres. And the Surveyor General on the donation land claim patent, or when they would go through the process, they would actually declare which half the wife got in the event of his death or divorce or whatever. So there were a lot of 14, 15-year-old young ladies getting married back then because it was a wonderful opportunity to gain another half a square mile. So then they said that you had to be a resident between December 1st of 1850 and 1853 for later arrivals. And you still had to be a white male. You had to be a citizen of, or with the intention of becoming a citizen of the state. Or at that time, actually, the territory. Territory. So you had to be, they changed the age from 18 to 21. And you had to be, cultivating that land for 4 consecutive years. You couldn't leave a gap in there. They cut the area down to 160 acres, or twice that if you're married. You can only have 1 donation per person, no mineral lands. And so apparently there were some people who knew that there were mineral lands on their property, but they would go out there and they'd put a blindfold on over their head and say that I see no mineral lands. And they'd make that statement in front of 2 witnesses. The witnesses go back and attest to that on paper, and that was it. And so there was a lot of fraud going on in those days. But anyway, you had to notify the Surveyor General. So there were some real rigid guidelines there. 16 and 36, those 2 sections were set aside for public schools. And back in some of the other territories, the U.S. government was selling land for $1.25 an acre. So here they wanted to see this settlement occur. So they were doing everything they could, not only one to legitimize the existing settlers, but they wanted to see more settlement take place in Oregon too. The tract had to be in compact form. It had to be taken as nearly as practicable by legal subdivisions, that is to say, those square miles. And where they weren't subdivided into square miles, then the Surveyor General would mark and survey the boundaries of the claim. Most of the time, that second part there, where it says the Surveyor General would mark and survey the boundaries of the claim, those were done by the county surveyor back then. And so many of those didn't take place until after. I mean, you couldn't do it until if you had to. The donation land claims had to be surveyed to a section corner. There was no way you could have a DLC floating out there in the middle of nowhere. It had to be tied to a section corner. So that meant they had to get out there and survey these sections, the square miles, the nice north, south, east, west lines first. Then they come back later under contract to the county surveyor who held up his hand in Oregon City and said, I promise to do blah, 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 according to the manual instructions for the survey of public lands. I promise to do all those things. And then he would tie to those section corners with every one of these donation land claims. And the Surveyor General would put that in the book and make a note on the plat. The claimant was required to do these things. He had to come up with 2 disinterested witnesses. But you can, as you look at those statements by those disinterested witnesses, a lot of times you'd notice that they were the neighbors. I mean, you think about it, 1 square mile per person or per couple, basically. That's a lot of land. So you get your nearest neighbor and you make a trip up to Oregon City to get the paperwork started. And down toward the bottom there where it says the Surveyor General would do those things, the first one there is the critical one to keep in mind, that issue of the certificate. He would forward all those documents and the proofs to the General Land Office in Washington, D.C., and then eventually the GLO would issue a patent to that land, which just says the government hereby is giving you this land or selling it to you as the case may be. 7,329 DLCs, and we had a little bit less than 400 in our county. But all the West County wasn't accounted for because that wasn't considered to be cultivatable land out there. So it was just they called it uncivilized territory, basically, on some of the earlier maps. So here we are, we're up to 1850, 1853. The land was no longer free. They were selling it for $1.25 an acre. So here comes the amendment of 1853. There was still a lot of moaning here in the Northwest because people hadn't met the timelines of the earlier Donation Land Act, so they extended this time. They reduced the occupation time to 2 years, but the date is pretty critical up there at the top, 1853. You can see that they were extending that act, and they were forcing them to pay for their land at this time. And so it went all the way up to 1855, that they could come in and kind of open up that door. Still trying to see settlement here in Oregon. You only had to occupy for 1 year, and you had to, or at that time they came up with a separate Surveyor General for the entire territory of Washington. So that kind of took a load off the Oregon City Surveyor General. And of course, here's another amendment, 1864, late filings and final proofs. You could actually have your heirs. If the original claimant had died, then the heirs could do that. These were the number of Oregon City, or the number of Oregon general land offices. And you can see 2 in La Grande and 5 in the Dalles, and the rest, of course, were here on the west side. Roseburg grew pretty good in its time, but Oregon City, of course, was the king of the land grants that were issued. Here's what you had to do to establish that DLC. Get your notification in. You had to have that proof of citizenship. You had to have the marriage proof. You had to show that you're actually fulfilling the requirements of the residency. You had to have that survey done so they knew how to locate it, how to describe it. And then if it was taken as an allocable part, then state what the allocable part was. This is the notification. This is what they would submit to the General Land Office describing that land. It's kind of hard to read anything on that, but that's the old handwritten methods that they would use. That's the form that was to be used by them at that time. They submit that to the General Land Office in Oregon City. And here's a proof of citizenship. These are notes. I'm sorry they didn't come out very good. These are actually scanned original notes from a donation land claim survey. So you had to wait till you got all these things. Oh, by the way, you'll see a little website on there. I don't know if any of you want to look at that later. I can tell you what it is. I've got it memorized. You can go there and look up all these donation land claims, the original field notes, and that's one of them right there. I'm sorry you can't zoom in on that and show you very much more detail, but they are in color, and you can see sometimes where they use red ink for trying to stress different things and whatnot. And they've just done that within the past few years. So they're all out for the entire state.
I have a question.
Sure.
How would they prove their citizenship? So many people came from other places. How would you prove they were a citizen?
Patsy wants to know how they prove they're a citizen. I don't know. I have no clue.
You know, sometimes they weren't even from this country.
Well, that would be easier to prove than if you were, though. I mean, if you came from another country, you probably would have some proof.
That's probably true.
But if you were born there, then how do you...
I'm not a genealogist. Maybe, I don't know, Carol, maybe you have an idea. How were they proving up on their birthright from, say, Virginia or some...
In the old days, that was always a problem.
Yeah?
Probably what I've seen in some of the early is later on when they started filing in certain states, you would have a relative attest to your birth, saying on this date, I was there, that person was born at home, because they didn't have birth certificates per se.
Yeah.
And it was hard to get back and forth, you know, to get somebody to say that you were a citizen. You see what I mean?
Absolutely, and when you're dealing with somebody from the East Coast, where you may, you know, that maybe where you came from, or Florida, or whatever, and you had to deal by, you know, you had to go around the horn or over the mountains, and
They
it
probably
was
just said, well, if you say so, it's okay.
yeah. So the meets and bounds claims, those are the ones that were not nice, even square portions of sections of square miles were given these donation land claim numbers, starting with 37, so as not to confuse you with the sections that were numbered 1 through 36, if you'll recall. So here's the big one, this patent certificate. Boy, if you got that, that was time to celebrate, because that meant that finally the United States government recognized the authenticity of your claim, and they said that you had met all these requirements, and that these facts were being certified back to the Commissioner of the General Land Office in Washington. And it was actually just one of the steps in the process, but it was really good for these folks out here. They couldn't tax, the county couldn't tax you. On the other hand, you couldn't mortgage that claim, but I got to tell you, there was a lot of claim swapping and stuff going on back in those days. There really was. You look at the records, you can go back to the title. Of course, our courthouse burned to the ground in 1859, the same year statehood, and we lost a lot of records in that. But we have a lot of other ways of proving that there were a lot of land swaps going on prior to these patents actually being issued by the United States government. So even though it wasn't legal, it was happening. And you know, if you had settled on your land and improved it a lot, and you didn't have the cash or any way of coming up with the cash, you could usually work out a deal with whoever you're dealing with in town to, there weren't very many banks at that time either, but you could usually work out some kind of a deal to have some kind of mortgage against your claim, illegal though it may have been. So here's one of those certificates, and it's got a certificate number up in the upper left-hand corner. That's number 3569. And like I said, that was a time to celebrate, because they had done everything and done all the paperwork, and there were a lot of them that didn't get this far.
Dan, is that a county number or a state number?
That's actually a United States government number issued by the General Land Office in Oregon. Or it actually says Washington, D.C. So the patent was issued in Washington, D.C., but the certificate was issued from Oregon City. So like I said, it did take years to get that. After you submitted that certificate, which contained all the proofs and everything, it took years for them sometimes. Sometimes these patents didn't come down until after the turn of the century.
So the bureaucracy isn't just now, it's long time ago.
Absolutely right.
Dan,
Yeah.
you said that there was a residency requirement was 4 years, and then it was 1 year. Was that after they got this document, or was that initially, and did that mean until they could sell it, or?
No, they had to prove up on it as part of the certificate. To get the certificate that actually would have forwarded all the facts, the proofs, and everything back to Washington, D.C., they had to actually go out and do these things. And sometimes the settlers got in trouble. For example, Lafayette was the hotbed of political activity and commerce in the entire county of Yamhill at the time. So there were a number of businesses in Lafayette. And the businesses were operated and owned by people who lived out in the country. Well, come to find out, they've been doing that since the 1840s, and Lafayette was established in 1846, and so they were told by the United States government that they had to go out and settle their land and improve their land, or they were going to lose their claim. So it caused a certain amount of friction. Did that answer your question?
No.
Sorry?
I was curious about the residency requirements. What did the 4 years mean? Until they started the process, or did they have to live on it 4 years to start the DLC process, or was it 4 years until they could sell it, or?
No, they turned in their initial notification, if you remember the notification form, and that just said, I'm notifying the United States government that I'm making a claim on this land pursuant to this act of Congress, blah, 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 blah. So then they would start the process at that time. The certificate would be issued at the end of that time, at the end of occupancy. Does that make sense?
Okay.
At the end of whatever the requirement was for their occupancy and improvement.
Okay. So they could sell it after that then? Did they always have to live on it, or does it
Well,
now be taxed by the county? Was it there's?
You know what? There weren't any donation land claim cops at the time. So they would have. There was a lot of shenanigans going on, I suppose, but for the most part, they knew that they had to show some improvements. And later on, in later years, not in Yamhill County, but especially down south, there were syndicates created that all they did was fraudulent land swaps. The Benson Syndicate, they just did timber swaps and just crazy shenanigans until finally Congress caught wind of it and proved up on it, and some people went to jail. So anyway, with the patent, once you got that patent, after you'd already done all the work and everything, then that actually said the United States government is handing you this. This is an original patent right here. I'll pass this around. You can look at it afterwards. And I think this came down in I can't read it. It was 1858, and it was recorded in the Yamhill County Clerk's office in 1867. Now, I don't know if the original was burned in the fire, and so they asked for a duplicate or what, but somebody had written on here that this is signed by, this is to Daniel and Elcina Johnson, who were the grandparents of Iona Westerfield, and it was signed by James Buchanan, the president, in 1858. However, that really isn't his signature on there. That's some underling, just a recorder or a secretary. So now that you've got the patent, the land can be taxed by the county. So here's a quiz. What is that? What does adequate part mean? Anybody have an idea? Mr. Herring? Some subdivision portion of that section. That would mean like a half or a quarter. So the northwest quarter of the northeast quarter of section 22, that just means, when you spell it out there, that's what it is. You take the northwest quarter, which would be 160 acres, if I'm doing my math right, and you take the north, one of the quarters of that, and you end up with 40 acres. It just means exact divisor. In Latin? Exact divisor of the fraction of a whole. So there's an adequate part right there. So that would be a 40-acre parcel right there, 1 square mile. 40 acres out of 640 acres. So in Yamhill County, our donation land claims were mostly by meets and bounds, and that would mean that they weren't nice square north, south, east, west, and those are much harder to locate than the ones that were north, south, east, and west in conformity with the sectionalized lands.
Probably named a tree, a certain tree, and a rock, and things like that.
Oh yes. Well, the section corners did too. Of course, the section corners had to be the first, and so the contracting surveyor, usually the county surveyor, who tied these settlers' claims down, they had to tie them to mathematically by survey to the sectionalized land. All the claims in Eastern Oregon were alpha parts. They were all nice square. And around here, they're just random. They just look like crazy patch quilt work. Patsy, do you have a question?
Well, I was just going to say, that people would just go mark, as he says, a tree or this, anything that they can establish the boundaries, and they wouldn't be square or anything else.
That's right. And by the time settlement moved to the south, especially south of the Roseburg, down in the Medford area and whatnot, they by then the Oregon Surveyor General had said, you will make your claims conform to the sectionalized lands. You look at their maps down there for donation land claims, and they're all nice square or rectangular in shape. And in this area where we had such early settlement, that wasn't the case at all. So here's a donation land claim description, and that's Washington County actually, but you'll see there it says north 40 chains, west 61.42 chains, and then it goes a crazy bearing, south 10 degrees, 45 minutes, east 40.86. After a while you get to where you recognize these guys' handwriting, and you can actually figure out what all that chicken scratching means and make sense of it. Of course, a chain is 66 feet, and that's the only unit of measurement that they used back then, chains and links. A link, of course, would be 1/100 of a chain. So you had these numbers. The notification number, that's the initial one where the settler would tell the Surveyor General's office that, hey, I'm making this claim. I'm notifying you of that, and I have to do that pursuant to that act. And then you had the certificate number, and of course your claim number was assigned by that office. But once, as I can't stress enough that certificate, that was so critical to what these settlers wanted. And when they got that certificate, I bet they really rejoiced, because that was a lot of work. They staked their entire fortunes here in the state on getting that certificate. I kind of threw this together to give you an idea of how many claims in the various townships. Notice over in the West County, you see zeros. That's clear up a timber country. And of course, right here in McMinnville, in this township, 4 South, 4 West, 52 claims. That's the highest density of any claims in the county. And of course, 49 up in the Yamhill area, 38 over in Newburgh, or 25 in Newburgh, and 38 Dundee, Newburgh area. So you see the distribution there. I guess you could say that the good farmland, like for example down by Grand Island and west of there, going towards Sheridan, that's all relatively good farmland. And so, not that there isn't good farmland up in the Yamhill or even over in Lafayette, Dayton, and up toward Dundee, but the center of population and commerce was kind of that triangle there of 49, 52, and 35, maybe even part a little bit of Dundee. Of course, Dundee and Newburgh at that time there was no settlement to speak of in these early days. I mean, there was settlement, but there wasn't any town. So McMinnville and, of course, Lafayette were the big towns. And look at the numbers of settlement in this area right here. So that kind of, it's a little bit of a different take. This is actually H.S. Maloney, Hundley S. Maloney, and he was the county surveyor. He had been a government surveyor back in the 1880s, and he'd done some of the surveying. Actually did some of the surveying over in the Madras area for the Indian reservation over there. And he was getting ready here to go down to survey the Polk County line in 1890. And I don't know how many of you recall the presentation we gave on that line and what a mess that got to be, but they kind of agreed between Polk and Yamhill County that they just go out and survey it, and everybody agreed that line. Well, guess what? We're a creation of the state legislature, not of our own county commissioners, so it didn't work out quite the way they anticipated. He later became the county recorder in Yamhill County. And of course, his son, Tom Maloney, worked over Davidson Auto Parts for many years. And there's, I think one of Tom's sons named Tom works for City Water and Light. I think I've got that right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Where's Wheatland?
Oh. Well, there we go. Wheatland is right, there's Wheatland Ferry right there.
Okay.
Now we're going to talk a little bit about the Homestead Act. It came after the donation land claims. Here we go, 1862. So by 1853, they were selling land for $1.25 an acre. By 1862, started the Homestead Act. And here are the requirements. 160 acres, $34. You had to live there for 5 years. After 6 months of living there, you could pay up $1.25 an acre and get that land. So 160 acres. You had to say that you're going to become a citizen, or you had to be one already. Here's the first guy, Daniel Freeman, 1868, Nebraska.
Yay.
What was that, Shirley?
Nebraska, too.
Okay. And you knew him, okay, good. Here's the last one, Mr. Deardorff in Southwest Alaska in 1988. So this Homestead Act went for quite a while. And then, of course, we had railroad land grants starting in the 1860s. And so they were trying to get these railroad companies to build their lines so that they could support commerce and transportation into these territories, states. And so they'd give every odd number square mile for 20 miles back on each side of the right-of-way to the railroad. Just give it to them. And this was to recoup what it cost them to build the rail. They couldn't sell it for more than 2.5 an acre. They did have to pay taxes, and 170 million acres set aside. There's what was happening at that time. There's the patch quilt you can see in the lower left-hand corner. There's the rails going down the center of it, kind of, and then the patch quilt of every other section. And that went back for 20 miles. And that went, clear up into after the turn of the century. But by 1913, they knew there were some real problems with fraud and whatnot, and so the Congress took back 3 million of those acres. So when you do your donation land claim research, you've got to remember that not all of those claims went through the entire process, and so they got kicked out for a number of reasons. And that certificate is crucial. You had to have that. And there is, in the Oregon State Archives, you can get this list of the ones that were rejected for various reasons. And of course, got to look for the parent counties. Now, we're one of the parent counties, but there are courthouses in the state much older than ours because our first one that kept the records that didn't burn to the ground was actually occupied in 1860 or 61, somewhere there. So that's basically when our records start. Oregon State Archives, you can get all those records of these DLCs on microfilm. You have to know that DLC number. And there, once again, is that website I told you about earlier. And that's where you can get those, the actual maps of the entire plat. Like when I was talking about the McMinnville area, that's 36 square miles. You can get a map of that entire 36 square miles. You can download it from that website for free. Now, you're going to have a pretty big printer to print that out because you think about a square mile that's going to, on an 8.5 by 11 sheet, it's only going to be half an inch wide. You're not going to get much detail unless you zoom in on it and print it out. But I'd be more than happy. I help people with that kind of stuff all the time. They call up and say, I can't print this out. What am I going to do? And I try to hold their hand and get them through that. So I just wanted to point out what the resources were here. A guy named Calbert White was a surveyor for the BLM for many, many years, and he came up with this case book on Oregon donational land claims. And that's one of the good resources on this stuff. And of course, county records and the BLM. And the AOC, the Association of Oregon Counties, has those records. All those donation land claims and plats are on the Association of Oregon Counties website. And of course, the Oregon State Archive. That's it.
Yeah.
I'm going to pass this around. We can turn the lights back on if you want. And this is the original patent, like I said. So when you hold this, you're holding a little bit of history. And Jean, our book lady at the museum, brought down some of the, she's always trying to sell books. Yeah, she brought down some of the books that I had written back in 1994 or 1995 that are the road name origins of the road, of all of our roads in Yamhill County that are county roads. I didn't go into the public roads. And I think those are $3, Dean, is that right? Yeah. We also have this 1879 map that is real close to what the patents were, but by 1879, as I pointed out earlier, there had been a lot of swaps. A lot of patents had been issued by 1879, and so a lot of transfers had taken place, and you'll see names on here that you don't see in the donation land claim list. And these are $2 a piece, I believe, yeah. The original of this is on file in the county, or in the Oregon State Historic Society, and they sell them too. This was actually somebody way back when had made marks on it for the voting precincts. So you see the South Fork precinct, which is Sheridan, Willamina, McMinnville, Amity, Dayton, Lafayette. North Fork of the Yamhill, which is kind of up in the Yamhill Carlton area, and then West Chehalan and East Chehalan area. So Dayton, and of course the Willamette. They call it the Willamette. That's where Wheaton Ferry was. Any questions? Richard?
Did the Indians get anything out of this? Did the Indians get any benefit out of this? I mean, the land was basically taken away from them. Did any of these monies that go to the government, did any of the ones that wind up on the reservation?
The ones who survived all the influenza and everything that they weren't used to seeing, yeah. The ones, they got rounded up and sent to the reservation. Right. Now, they were given that reservation. Those are basically created, those were created by the government as separate lands, and they, they're not even really part of what we call the state.
They're separate nations.
They're separate nations, and so they have their own rules and their own everything. So that's a little bit on that. There's a lot to that, a whole lot to that. Bureau of Indian Affairs is who you want to talk to about that kind of stuff. But in the 1850s, they rounded up a bunch of them, and of course Fort Yamhill, just over the Polk County line, was one of the first reservations.
That Fort Yamhill is now open as a cultural
Right,
resource.
it's a park. It's a state park. It's the only one of its
And they've got
kind.
these nice little paths going everywhere, and they've been doing digs. It's really cool.
Yeah.
Dan, what happened? It's quite I certainly never realized what a terrible process it must have been to get all what happened? That somewhere along the line, you couldn't do that. What happened then?
What, okay, if you were too late of an arrival, you just didn't qualify, and you were out of luck, so you had to buy it.
Does somebody, could somebody just come and take it then?
We have a number of sites that we have the donation of land claim surveys on, and we know exactly where the corners are and everything, but it was never patented. So it's out in the middle of this land. It's an oddball shape. We know there was a settler there. We even know his name. We don't know much about him because we don't really, in our office, pay that much attention to it. But it never went through the whole process. So they were rejected for one way or another.
What happened to that piece then?
Well, they were sold off eventually.
That you could, if you had to, say you had a problem, could you buy that piece?
If you came after that guy had basically lost his claim, then you could come up and you could buy it.
I mean, if you were the person who bought it.
Oh, okay, yeah. I see what you're saying. I don't know that you would have any more right than any other settler at the time who came up with the money. It was probably the first come, first served with the money in hand, and that's what the government was charging, $1.25 an acre or whatever it was, $2.50 an acre, and they got it. So.
Jerry Smith brought a copy of his book in his family's, it's in his coat box.
Way to go, Jerry.
Get it out, Jerry.
Mine's a little different than yours. This is just a copy of the original.
Yeah, the one that I passed around there is the original, or a duplicate thereof, I'm not sure which, but Jerry's brought a real, this is even clearer, it hasn't faded as much. And who is this? This is for one of your relatives? Or?
It would be my grandmother's grandparents settled out here on Township 5, Range 6, Section 12, just outside of the Yamhill County line, off of Ballston Road.
So in the year of our Lord 1866, this patent was issued. So that 1866. So they may have settled here in the 1840s.
Yeah, they came here in 1847.
There you
They
go.
got here late,
So
and they spent their first winter at Fort Vancouver. Then in the spring they came and settled on that land.
so 18 years it took. Number one, to help to they had to work with everybody else to try and get the government to even allow this to occur. And then they had to go through the steps, the hoops the government forced them to go through to even gain the land. So that's really neat. Would it be okay to pass this around? Okay. I'll pass this one around this side. I don't know where the other one went. We want it back, by the way. Okay, Shirley? All yours.
That was great, wasn't it? Is the name list floating around here somewhere because it hasn't gotten over here yet? Oh, by the name tags. Okay. Did anybody get it right in here to sign? Shirley, can you go get that name thing in there, please? Let's see. Barbara, what was? I don't know who brought the turkeys, but they're very pretty.
I know it.
Turkey farmer, I brought some.
Turkey farmer Marge Owens brought the turkey. Next time we'll be at the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and Nancy Thornton is asking various of you to share Christmas memories. So it's going to be a Christmas patchwork.
Right. Just a little bit of traveling news. I'm going to Germany the end of the month, and we're going to get on a boat. We're going to go down the Danube and go into Vienna, and we're going to hit all the Christmas markets. I'm getting pretty excited. I've got me some long underwear, so I'm ready. Okay, I can't think of anything else for this evening. Thank you. Be sure and catch that list and get it signed.